afternoon and good evening to everyone. Welcome to the International Water Resource Association webinar on water climate change and a holistic approach led by IWRA's Water and Climate Change Task Force members. We thank you all for joining us today. Our panelists today include Malcolm Gander, as well as Alex Goroy he's an associate professor at the University del Desarrollo, and he's also a visiting scholar at Harvard University. We have also David Molden, who is the IWRA honorary member and a former director general from the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. Then we also have Paula Pacheco from the University of Montpellier and Gurabit Singh. He's an environment science teacher and research editor. Well, this is a webinar hosted by the International Water Resource Association. IWRA is an international network of researchers and practitioners who work on a multidisciplinary range of water resource issues. It provides a global knowledge-based forum for bridging disciplines and geographies by connecting professionals, students, individuals, corporations, and institutions who are concerned with the sustainable use of the world's water resources. Let me just briefly explain the format of today's webinar. We will have an introduction from our moderator, Raya Stefan, who is the co-chair of the Climate Change Task Force. And after that, we will hear the presentation from each of our speakers. Then we will have a small panel discussion, and towards the end, we will have space for questions and answers. So please put your questions in the Q&A box at any time. In a few seconds, I will activate it so you can pose your questions and also use the chat box to introduce yourself and tell us from where you are joining us. And yes, as a way for you to introduce yourself, the audience, please, in the chat box, you can mention what is your name, what is your age group and gender, from where you are joining us today, and where do you work. With that in mind, I would like to turn the floor over to our moderator. Raya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arturo. To my turn, I would like to welcome all the participants to the webinar organized by the IWRA Task Force on Water and Climate Change, which I have the pleasure to co-chair with Gurabit. I'm also a lawyer, a water law expert, and the deputy editor-in-chief of IWRA's journal Water International. As you all know, it's a well-known fact and accepted fact now that water is at the heart of the climate crisis. Climate change is affecting the water cycle in many ways, either through severe droughts, as we know now in Europe, or through heavy rains causing floods and other disasters. Climate change is actually increasing and exacerbating the already existing pressures on water resources worldwide. The Water and Climate Change Task Force of IWRA was formed to reflect on science to policy orientation to adapt and build more resilience in water management. The task force which is led by a bureau of who gives the general orientations of the task force, and it is composed of various working groups which tackle each one climate change under a different angle. Among the working groups, we have a water working group tackling water pollution, nature-based solutions, mountains and plains, energy, floods, and we can, of course, always create other working groups if we have interested and active members. Without taking more time, I would like to now give the floor to our first speaker, Malcolm Gander. Malcolm chairs the Water Pollution Working Group in our task force. He has a global experience as a hydrologist and environmental manager, and he currently oversees applied research in various groundwater techniques. Malcolm represents about water resources and adaptation to climate change.
Very good, thanks, Raya. Next slide. So let's talk about some of the foundational aspects of water resources and climate change. And one of the main things we need to keep in mind is the use of groundwater. And groundwater globally supplies about half of all drinking water. And previous slide,
Sorry.
we want to keep in mind that when we have the effects of climate change and global warming, we have more extreme storms, probably less storms, but the storms are more extreme, more runoff, less recharge, and that means that the aquifers, which are getting further exploited, are being, we're just not seeing as much recharge into the aquifers due to the global warming and the runoff. So let's talk about some of the adaptation strategies that we can already implement or that can be implemented. Next slide. So when we have these extreme temperatures, more runoff, wastewater treatment plants can get overloaded, and we can also see increases in diseases such as malaria, spread of E. coli from raw sewage. There's a lot of uncontrolled aspects when we have these extreme storms, and water quality having to do with the runoff from the use of fertilizer is a large problem. Next slide. Let's talk about the 7 adaptation strategies, really the main message of my presentation today. Protection of coastal wetlands. This is an interesting one. We all know that the sea level is rising, but features such as salt marshes, mangroves along our coastal ecosystems can naturally filter the water. They can act as a buffer against sea level rise, storm surges, and such. And this is something that can be developed or maintained at a relatively low cost. Next, promote sustainable agroforestry. This is the integration of using trees and shrubs with the grazing of livestock. Not something that is really being done, but again, it's something relatively low cost. Decentralizing the energy distribution. This is the third of the 7 points. We have a lot of electrical grid systems in the European Union countries and in the US, but also in developing nations. And when we have overuse from air conditioning or just use of electrical power, the grid can go down. And if we can have smaller power sources, this is something that can guard against these widespread outages, and it will have a improved health effect for a lot of citizens. Next slide. Securing indigenous people's land rights. This is something that Gaurav and Paul, I think, are going to touch on. So indigenous communities manage over 50% of the Earth's land surface and over 2.5 billion people. They've been practicing adaptation principles, conservation, less deforestation than we're seeing in a lot of countries, such as Brazil, South America, and so forth. So this is an important aspect that policymakers need to realize. We need to support the indigenous people and their land rights. Improving mass transit. 72% of the global transportation related emissions are from road transport. So if we can be more efficient about that, as we have extreme weather, as we have hotter temperatures, if we can use mass transit more, this is a common theme. It's really going to lower greenhouse gas emissions. Agricultural adaptation strategies, as we have more prolonged drought or extreme heat waves, we need to lower evaporation, and things like mulching really go a long way in agricultural areas to keep the moisture in and guard against um, the release of the moisture. And the last one, temperature pollution, is a broad term. Everyone knows about the warming of the oceans and how that, more than anything else, seems to drive temperature change and weather change in our world. But temperature pollution is also something in freshwater rivers that has a profound effect on the fisheries. And by reducing deforestation along rivers and water courses, keeping things a little cooler, it may seem rather simplistic, but it can have a profound positive effect. Next slide. So these are just some more points that I've touched on. Fertilizer runoff, algal blooms, all these things tend to happen during the stream storm events, larger glacial melt-off. David Molden will be touching on this. And this runoff, of course, raises sea levels, inundates the coastal cities, and this all has a cost effect. Next slide. Temperature pollution, it's the degradation of water quality by any process that changes water temperature. It's mostly a warming effect, but it can work in the other direction too. And up here in the Pacific Northwest of the US, there's been a lot of deforestation in these areas along the water courses, and that can raise the temperature, and it hurts the salmon fisheries, which is very, very popular and something that's very, very guarded around here. And it's not just in the freshwater and the salmon who migrate from the oceans and then up the water courses and the rivers. It has effects on whales as well. Next slide. Distressed salmon, lots of different types of salmon up here. Now, next slide. Data sharing between nations seems obvious, but takes a lot of work, is sometimes tedious, but these are things that the other speakers today will touch on, and it's absolutely essential for data sharing and understanding problems and working together on features such as mitigating flooding from, again, these extreme storm events. Next slide. And here I talked about the positive effects of mulching, locking in evaporation, but also in a more efficient manner when you till fields using techniques that can minimize the release of evaporation is another aspect of adaptation strategies that is effective. Next slide. So we want to be aware of the flood-prone areas by expanding the floodplains, preserving wetlands is very important, whether it's along the coasts or inland, artificial embankments, and obviously preparing coastal for inundation of sea level rise. Solution mitigating aspect is really understanding that wastewater treatment plants, which are used in many countries, they're collection points for pollutants. And it's not just for fertilizers and nitrogen and phosphorus, which is probably the most prevalent one, but there's chemicals of emerging concern, the most prominent being per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS. These wastewater treatment plants are collection points, and then they go through processing, which does not typically include carbon. Carbon catches PFAS, but that's not typically happening. So the effluent from wastewater treatment plants is going out, and it has higher PFAS, or there are biosolids, soils that have historically been used as fertilizer, and they do have positive effects, but unfortunately these biosolids have chemicals of emerging concern. Again, most prominently the PFAS, but also of the pharmaceuticals, which we are learning about globally. And these collection point aspects in the wastewater treatment plants, all of this is exacerbated
Malcolm,
when we get
please,
these
can you
storms.
start wrapping up?
Okay. So the wastewater treatment plants are really, it's really important to understand that they are not only collection points, but they have to understand that they will, we have to manage chemicals as well as the nutrients. Last slide. So these are the 7 strategies as we talked about, and I think I will stop there and we'll entertain questions at the end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Malcolm. I think your presentation was very good for the introduction because it gave an overview of many aspects that the following speakers will discuss. Now I would like to give the floor to Alex Godoy. He's an associate professor at the Universidad del Desarrollo in Chile, and he is also a visiting scholar at Harvard University. In our task force, Alex leads the Energy Working Group. Please, Alex.
Thanks, Soraya, and good morning, evening, and everyone. I am delighted to talk today, just maybe on connecting the dots between an extreme event and the water energy nexus, because as Malcolm said, and we need to work on the mitigation at the same time, on converting the fuel oils technologies in renewable technologies, and works and at the same time in adaptation pathways. But when we mention about adaptation pathways, the question is on what we are talking about, because on one thing of adaptation is about and how we can make our economy or society more resilient to the shocks. And I could just mention that maybe we are here because we have we have a large source of the global warming pollution. It's burning fossil oil. So right now, all people is working on mitigation to try to introduce renewable energy like solar energy and wind energy, but the people forget that maybe the dams and the hydroelectricity maybe is a key factor for the electricity grid. Just I need to mention, because I would like to connect the dots, and right now we know that according to the global warming, the global surface temperature is going up and every time. So this is a physical changes that we need to mention of that, because finally the last 19 years of the 20 hotter years has been in the 2 decades ago. So if indeed we think about the hottest of happening the 7 the hottest 7 years is just in 5 years ago. So what happened with this phenomena? And this phenomena is clear for the people that is watching this webinar. And we are increasing the global surface of the air temperature. And this is very well connected with what happened with the hydrological cycles, because in different parts of the world, near of the equator, and we are increasing the temperatures. And when we are increasing the temperature, we are suffering, and temperatures right now achieving over 50 Celsius degrees or 122 Fahrenheit, and in countries like, for example, countries like Iran, Kuwait, Oman, or Emirates. So, but what is the people see according of this phenomena is just higher temperatures. This is a very good example. This is in Portland, Oregon in 2021. The Portland broke its all-time heat record in June in 2001 in over 46 Celsius degrees, over 116 Fahrenheit. In Pakistan is the same phenomena, over 51 Celsius degrees or 120 Fahrenheit in June 2 in 2019. And has the temperature increase, and it has the temperature increase, and the phenomena is the oceans evaporate more, so we get more moisture into the sky. And the problem of this moisture is because they are suffering an alteration of the hydrological cycle, because when you decrease the evaporation, obviously the precipitation is increasing too, and this water is returning to the sea. The problem is all watershed that are providing fresh water and from the different water catchment and industrial activities and human activities has been suffering and water shortage. And so we have more heavy rainfalls and we have more downpours, but the downpours get bigger, right? So this is what happened. This is an extreme event in Texas in 2021, and you can see that and bigger downpours. And another kind of phenomena like extreme events, like in this tandem storms like Marco and Laura in 2020, affecting Cuba and Florida in United States. And the problem is the impacts of this kind of extreme event is, and the hurricanes Eta and Iota, for example, affected 7.3 million of people and killed more than 200 in Central America. Indeed, in Honduras, for example, and it's not a rich country. Honduras, is a developing country, and the storms cost $10 billion in damage. And this is the $10 billion in damage is 40% of the country. What I'm trying to say that this kind of phenomena is impacting the infrastructure, and the infrastructure is connected with energy, with water, and with maybe public works and so on. And finally, the developing countries and the most vulnerable countries doesn't have the budget to try to work at the same time on mitigation and adaptation. So if we get to the records about the global record about the breaking precipitation anomalies, every time we are increasing even more and more heavy rainfalls and drought and through the globe. So, and right now globally, the flood and extreme rainfall events now occur 4 times more often than in 19. So, and if you talk with the different people from different countries, and nobody right now is working to make more resilient infrastructure. Nobody, the people is very concerned about what happened with this kind of phenomena, but we are not working on. So indeed, in this last conference of party and then in Sharm el Sheikh, and we discussed about the loss and damage funds. But right now, and we have the money, but we don't have the guidelines for allocate of that, and we are not discussing how the countries are preparing for the future and to trying to alleviate or to trying to make a less vulnerable infrastructure to them. So, and this is what is, and let me connect in the dots. This is Iranduba in Amazonas state, Brazil in 2021. 400,100 people was affected by flooding in Brazil, in Rio Negro. No, you can see here, you can see the flooding, but it's affecting the connection and the electricity between housing and so on. And the Rio Negro broke the all-time flood record in the Amazon and rivers, and actually mean at the highest level flood on it. And here we have problems with the pipelines that Malcolm said, and so on. But it's not just there. This is an Hale-Waiton in Hawaii in 2021 that you can see the infrastructure was disrupted. And here's you have the disruption in electricity grid, you have the disruption in pipelines, you have the disruption in wastewater treatment plants, and so on. So, and this is another case in 2020 and during the COVID infection. This was and after the typhoon in India. This is Bangladesh. This Sundarbans is finished, and finally the people was killed, and a lot of people had to migrate. 1 million people migrate after this extreme event. But to say China, summer flooding in 2020 was this is climate disaster was causing $70 billion in damage. This is on Lake Louisiana after the hurricane and the strike and the Hurricane Laura, and grew from the Category 1 to Category 4 and storm in one single day. And this is South Korea, and this causing flooding in the South and North Korea, affecting all infrastructure related. And this is Japan, and at least 44 people was killed in torrential rain, caused flooding and landslides and mudslides, and this is what's happened, for example, in the flooding in Minnesota, affecting all kinds of infrastructure, specifically in energy and energy plants and so on. This was in Dakota. This was after the flooding. This is the idea is trying to that you can understand what is the real impacts of the extreme events and when we are suffering the alteration of the water cycle. And this was my Chile. This is very interesting because it was in 2021 in summer. We don't have an rain in summer. 170,000 people were without power. Indeed, we have maybe 1 week without any power in the metropolitan area like Santiago de Chile, where we live in 9 million people, Valparaiso, O'Higgins, and Maule regions. There was also a threat for interruption of drinking water and due to the turbidity into the rivers. So this is the case of the Nigeria. The September flooding destroyed 25% of the country. In this, the country's rice harvest was killed and then dozens people. And this is the France in 2020. It's the same experience and causing an energy disruption in France and Italy. This is the chemical and energy companies was affected after the flooding. Was a Dow Chemical Company in Midland, Michigan in 2020. The flooding forced the Dow Chemical Company to close his headquarters and shut down operations. And the Dow property in Midland home is Superfund taxes waste site right now. But for another side, we have the drought. The drought and the drying conditions in Mexico and in 2017 is causing some part of the Mexico City to sink up and 23 centimeters per year. And this is what's happened when you have destruction and is the destruction of water and affect the aquifer. And right now the city is affected on the ground. So if we have the records of the worldwide extreme weather catastrophes, you can see here the flood and mudslides are affecting the infrastructure, specifically in public works, energy facilities, and water facilities that Malcolm said. So indeed, just one case, this is the losses in United States according of economic losses from the climate-related events. And here you can see that every time and in every decade we are increasing the cost of the insurance paying from the insurance company and banks from the city or the citizens and companies. And you can see that the flood and the storm and maybe the most extreme event that causing the economic losses. And this is energy included. Why we are increasing the cost? Because we are suffering and we have a different kind of infrastructure at risk from extreme weather. We need to think that the flooding and drought is affecting the dams, for example, the flood barriers, the drinking water system, the sewage system, roads, bridge, airport, train tracks, power plants, power lines, internet and telephone lines, oil and gas pipelines, building foundations, stormwater drainage, aqueducts, and agriculture. So all infrastructure right now is in risk, and specifically on the infrastructure related to energy production. So if we want to connect in the dots, this is what happened when they draw. This is the Lake Romania. This is an Google engine between 94 until 96, and the level of the reservoirs is go down every time. So this is kind of reservoirs that have multiple proportions for irrigation in agriculture, for an electricity production, for drinking water, and so on. And every time in the last paper in Nature was showing that in different lakes and in the world, the levels are go down. So this is the case of California. You have another kind of dams, and the level is very critical. And this is the Nevada, for example. And here you can see the Lake of the Nevada in 2021. In United States, the large reservoir is its lowest level since in the 30s, just 100 years ago. But this is just the case. This is New Zealand. It's the same phenomena. In 2020, New Zealand, the reservoir was around 44 of the level of capacity. And when you have a flooding, we have this kind of the phenomena. This is a dam in Sanford, Michigan. All dam is already aging, and the infrastructure is not adapted to resist the flooding, and finally is affecting and downstream all kind of the human activities. So
Alex, can you please wrap up now?
Yes, just I am closing that. This is Taiwan, and what happened when we have a disruption of this kind of facility? We have a blackout. This is because finally the hydroelectricity is the main factor to keep the safe flow of electricity through the society, and all the old facilities like coal burning gas and nuclear and are using a lot of water is different to the solar and wind energy, and because the old technologies are very intensive water consumption. And finally, this is the link. We have water for energy. This is the last one. And we need water for energy for hydropower, cooling of power of plant, extraction of fossil fuel, renewable energy, and emission controls. And we need energy and for water supply system, water purification system, water distribution system, maybe desalination plants, water drainage system, and urban river system. So how we can need and connect the dots, and how we can prepare new plans and a new strategy for adaptation. This will be the next challenge for our generation and the future generation today. And thanks for listening. This is the last one. We need to understand how we can connecting the dots between the supply and demand of water. Thank you, and I have your question for the last presentation. Thanks, Raya, and thanks for the International Water Resources Association.
Okay, thank you, Alex, for this very informative presentation. And we can see that all regions of the globe are really affected by these extreme events. Now we will hear from David Molden. David Molden was the former chair of our task force, and he's also an honorary member of IWRA. David will talk to us about rivers of Asia who are dependent on the snows and glaciers of the mountains. David, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Raya. I hope everybody can hear. So what I'd like to do is take you all to the mountains of the Hindu Kush Himalaya and explore a little bit about what happens in the mountains and how that impacts water system, people, and nature downstream. The area that I would like to talk about is the Hindu Kush Himalaya, and that's shown in the blue. So these are the mountains and the hills of this connected mountain range, covering 8 different countries: Afghanistan, Pakistan, China, India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Nepal, and Bhutan. But from a water perspective, very great river system coming off these mountains, 10 different river basins. And you can see the names: Indus, Ganges, Yellow Yangtze, Mekong, Salween, Tarim, and Amu Darya. But we have about 240 million people who live in these HKH mountains, and about 1.65 billion people downstream. I should mention that I had worked in this area 9 years for ICIMOD, specializing in working in mountain resources. So that 1.65 billion people live downstream of mountains means that what happens in these mountain areas, that's Mount Everest, affects about 1/4 of humanity. But I think we don't really look at the mountains as that resource base perhaps as much as we should. So with climate change, temperature rise is amplified both at altitude as well as latitude. So we know that there's higher temperature rises faster at the polar regions, but also at very high elevations. So if we were to see a 1.5 degree world, what would happen at high elevations is that's actually 2.1 degree in the mountains. If we look at present emission trends at the rate of which climate change is proceeding by about 2100, this would mean an over 5 degree warming in mountain areas, and with very big implications for downstream. And let's follow that through. So one of the first questions is, what is happening to mountain glaciers? And this is the same region. And the dots are the size of the glaciers, and the pink or the red is how fast the glaciers are melting. And so we see large glaciers on the western side of the HKH that are melting. Some are not and are actually advancing. And then we see very fast melting of smaller glaciers on the eastern side of the Hindu Kush Himalaya. But basically, most glaciers are melting across this region. There was a report, the Himalaya Monitoring Assessment Program produced an assessment report and found that in a 1.5 degree world, we would lose about 1/3 of the volume of glaciers by 2100. If we go to present emission trends, we will lose about 2/3 of the volume of the glaciers, and that snow areas will also significantly decrease. And this will mean that snow will melt, runoff will be stronger and occur at different times of the year than we're used to right now. So if we look and ask the question, what is that contribution of glacier and snow melt to river systems? And here we have the rivers, especially the south flowing rivers. And in the blue, what it means is that most of the water coming off those mountains is from snow and glacier runoff. And that happens on the western side, Afghanistan, Hindustan, basically the dry side of the mountains. The red is less contribution from snow and glaciers, and most of the contribution is from rainfall. But with climate change, we will expect higher and more intense rain, also more droughts in that region. So in a way, we're still very much exposed to rainfall events. But most vulnerable to glacier and snow melt is the western side of the HKH region. So if we can follow that through, what will be the impacts downstream? We have the snow, we're moving downstream eventually to the ocean. We have irrigation, cities, hydropower, nature, all downstream. So going back to the mountains, this is a photo from Ladakh of a really beautiful mountain community and who do irrigated agriculture, but most of that irrigation is dependent on snow and glacier melt. And if you look at the very top of the photo, you can see little dots of glaciers, and some of these glaciers don't really have long in their lives. And the question is, what's going to happen to those communities downstream with climate change? And what we're finding now are mountain communities are already feeling the impact of climate change. A lot of poverty, a lot of vulnerability in this area. And a lot of literature points to climate change as a critical factor of outmigration. And much of that is due to both disasters as well as water shortages in mountains. This is we think of mountain areas as an area, and it is very high potential for hydropower. but we also see that the vulnerability to floods are increasing. This is a hydropower station in Nepal that was very much damaged by what we call a glacier lake outburst flood, a GLOF. Basically, at the end of the glacier, a lake gets bigger and bigger and eventually bursts out and carries with it all kinds of huge stones that has the power to wipe out these hydropower stations. So we have to take care of that in the future. Now, if we look downstream in the plains, the red area is the population density, right? So we see on the west side, the Indo-Gangetic Plain, highly populated, the North China Plains. So we see a lot of people living downstream dependent on those water supplies from mountain areas. And we have bigger cities growing in the region that are already under water stress. Irrigated agriculture is extremely important for food security, and we'll have to adapt. This is a photo from Nepal planting rice, but considering the Indus Basin, 90% of food is produced by agriculture, and about 60% of that is irrigation water comes from withdrawals from glacier and snowmelt. So there we are in that region, vulnerable to that glacier and snowmelt. We heard a lot from Alex about that disaster risk increasing, and that's very true in mountain areas as well. Of course, the bigger dots, the different floods, a lot of the disasters are from flooding. Many of the floods do cross borders between countries. And it certainly is the poor, vulnerable women who are most vulnerable to these floods and droughts. A photo from that's India and Nepal. One of the questions was how to prepare for floods, and an answer is take care of the watershed, the landscape in the watershed area in the hills and mountains is one answer. Another is, and what we did a lot was put in flood early warning systems. A lot of those community-run flood early warning systems that were helpful and did save lives. So what are a few key actions? And many, and we've heard a lot, but one I think is, we talk about climate change, and a lot of that we're talking at, from space, looking at large areas and temperature changes, but really where the action is with the communities. And so we really need to focus in a lot on vulnerable communities and work together to build these adaptation strategies and build resilience. By the way, that's a picture of me in the left corner looking at a hydraulic ram pump. The glaciers were melting, less water for communities. So the idea was, could we pump up water from the rivers to serve the communities? And this was really a great experience working with this community in northern Pakistan. But I think also, we see that climate change does not know boundaries. Mountains are crossing many countries. The impacts downstream cross many countries. And cooperation is so essential in this regard. And to improve the science base, let's put our minds together. And basically, politically, this is a difficult area, but it was very interesting that people did work together on the science. We have a lot of opportunities for flood early warning systems that cross boundaries, linking upstream and downstream activities. And through our water systems, is there a better way to coordinate water supply, energy, and transport? And finally, in events like COP, can we come up and stand together and have a united voice for mountains? And with that, I'd like to thank everybody, acknowledge the great work of ISIMOD, but also appreciate very much work. I have appreciated working with the IWRA and its task force on climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for this very informative presentation and the focus on the mountains in Asia. We will move with Paula to mountains in another region of the world, in South America. Paula is a researcher at the University of Montpellier in France and Agua Sustentable in Bolivia. She will speak to us from Bolivia, and she also co-chairs the working group on mountains and plains. Paula, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I will talk about local knowledge and citizen science for climate change in the Bolivian Andes. So some opening remarks just to see some of the facts at the Andes in South America. There is an unknown number of low and medium altitude glaciers that have already disappeared, and the projections indicate that many others are also likely to vanish over a few decades. In the Bolivian Andes, more than 50% of the glaciers have been lost in the last 40 years due to climate change. This may significantly decrease the amount of glacier meltwaters available to stream and aquifers, which are critical to ecosystem, farmings, and the economy of vulnerable regions in Bolivia. Almost same as what David has said about the Himalayan region. In addition, the rural communities of this region are also threatened by economic uncertainty, so they are more vulnerable. And as a response of this situation, many farmers have chosen both to migrate temporarily or permanent to many of the cities like La Paz, where I live, and other strategies on adaptation. So what Sustainable Water, which is the organization that I used to work for, have proposed is certainly a holistic approach, so an integrated approach on how to deal with this uncertainty and with the climate change in the future. So we looked at this figure of a butterfly. A butterfly has 4 wings normally, but if one wing doesn't work, then the butterfly won't fly. So what we said is that one of each of the wings are capacity building strategy. So one of the first wing is human resources development, which we think it has to be developed to respond and to be more resilient to climate change. The second wing is the organizational development. The third is the development of networks, also what my previous presentation said, to work together, to integrate the knowledge, to exchange knowledge, not only between the different regions, but also between the different professions, the different researchers, and so on. And the fourth wing is to enforce the policy and rules development. So we think that only if the 4 wings are working together, so the development of capacities are on the same level of these 4 wings, then the butterfly will fly and we can be more resilient to climate change. I will talk a little more deep about organization development. We researched about the recovery of traditional knowledge plus the new technology. That could be a very interesting formula for the appropriation of adaptation strategies. So I will give some examples of what we practice or we saw in the Bolivian Andean regions. For example, to deal with droughts, people and the indigenous people do rituals in the hills accompanied by prayers, fasting, and offerings to Pachamama. According to a foundation, Agricolandes, the Anaman is in permanent research of balance between some factors: the production, the wisdom, the destiny, and the way of life. They used to carry also water from springs to lagoons that contain the water from springs, accompanied by rituals. They placed at the ainocas or farms, and sometimes it used to rain, and they carried also toads and made them cry on the hill, so to return the water to the rivers. They also use excavations and manual wells that we call cochas, the construction of viginas, that is also rainwater harvesting strategies. the construction of terraces, as you can see in the picture, the transportation of water from some rivers, the mulch of soil, the crop diversification used to be also a very important adaptation strategy. The purchase, for example, of corns or other dry beans to have food for the winter, because winter in this region is a very dry season. Also planting and frost transversally to the slope, as you also can see in the pictures. There are some specific practice for rainwater harvesting. There was a project financed by IWRA, where we redesigned the terraces from the Incas. So we reconstructed the terraces in one of the regions to keep the humidity of the crops and also maintain and harvest rainwater. So some of the practices are these cotañas that I already mentioned, that are reservoirs to collect water in some micro basins. The cochas that are also excavations, but a little more smaller, also to minimize the risks of frost and droughts. Also the terraces that I'm talking about, and the curmicotas that are some traps to harvest water for native grasses. These are some examples of the infrastructure combined with traditional knowledge in the Bolivian Andes. This is only a picture just to show that this work has done with the integration also, for example, with the militaries in Bolivia, with the integration of work with the indigenous and militaries. There are also some indicators that could predict a little about the future of climate. Of course, it's a short-term prediction. They used to call bioindicators. They used to have biological indicators, astronomic indicators, and atmospheric indicators. In the biological indicators, they used to use phytoindicators, the soil indicators, like floration, the growth of the plants, the fruits, seeds, the migration, the colors, and also the indicators. They used to watch at astronomical indicators like the moon, the sun, the stars, and also atmospheric indicators like the clouds, the wind, and the snow. These are also very specific bioindicators, but it's very interesting. For example, we have a specific plant at the Bolivian altiplano, which is called the tola. So the flowering season and the seed quality were observed. The bad seed was an indicator of a bad year, so a drought year. Also, the fox was used to predict the climate. So observe this fox observing the month of September. When it holds and stalls, it means that it was going to be a bad year. Also, but some specific spider, when it made the nest and does not it didn't cover, it meant that it will not rain that year. Also, some of the birds that are specific from the Bolivian altiplano used to they were observed by the indigenous people to see if it was going to rain or not. About atmospheric indicators like clouds, the clouds were used to be observed for the plantation of quinoa, for example, which is a very important crop in the Andes. So the movement of clouds were observed and monitored between August and September. And if there were no clouds, for example, the first days of August, then it was very bad to plant in October and November. They used to also observe the stars, about the constellations and the Pleiades. And they used to also do some festivals and rituals to call the rain for this region. So what is Yatin Uta? Because I think you saw at my first slide, Yatin Uta is it's an expression in Aymara, which is an indigenous language. It means knowledge, home of knowledge. This is a place at the Sahama National Park that the communities built as a center of knowledge. We also help enforcing this center of knowledge. It's a physical space, but also a virtual space that the communities of the Sahama Mountain use to teach about climate change, to teach about glaciers, and to teach about wetlands in the region. They are hoping to receive student tourism, researcher tourism, so they can study more their region and they can give them responses on climate change adaptation.
Paula, please.
They also use innovative tools like drones and these kind of things for researchers to practice and give, like I said, responses to climate change. This is only a picture of a GIS that they are constructing. And now I'm going to give the conclusions. All traditional knowledge is relevant and are strategic. The thing is that it's important to combine traditional knowledge with innovative knowledge. In that sense, we will respond to climate change. However, traditional knowledge are lost, almost lost, but it's a very important task for the researchers to acknowledge, to recover, and to disseminate this traditional knowledge to adapt to climate change. And thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Paula, for this very interesting presentation. We will remain with the traditional knowledge with our last speaker. Gauravjit is the co-chair with me of the Climate Change Task Force, but he has also other hats in our task force. He co-chairs the working group on water pollution with Malcolm and the working group on nature-based solution. Gauravjit, please, the floor is yours. Just before giving the floor to Gauravjit, I would like to remind the participants to ask their questions in the Q&A box. We will have time to answer your question to discuss just after listening to Gauravjit. Please, Gauravjit, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Raya, for the introduction and the floor. Welcome, everybody. We remain in the domain of indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge as a way to conserve the resources we have right now and how these people used to manage resources even before we weren't born. So my topic concerns how we can use faith, which many people adhere to, and traditional knowledge to preserve biodiversity, and especially focusing on water resources, the sacred forests and water bodies. We know that there has been a consistent and massive biodiversity loss since the 1950s. There is difference in where the loss is more. It accounts for like 94% in the Central American rainforests, and there is an overall 70% loss, out of which 83% loss is seen in freshwater species. So that makes it important why we need to conserve freshwater and also other aquatic resources. As we see, climate change is increasing the pressure on each and every global natural resource we have. So this is where faith plays a great role. It might play a great role because more than 8 people out of 10 in the world adhere to a specific religious group, or they seem to tend to some religious entity. Historically, faith communities have been playing a role in environmental stewardship and conservation. This is because many religions, whether in the Western culture or in the Eastern culture, have a sort of interconnectedness with the nature and the forests they grow up in and they die in. So that's why they consider the forests and the water bodies in the forest and out of the forest as sacred. They do not harm the water bodies or the nature surrounding them. This can inspire us to protect and conserve our natural resources and surroundings. Various faiths, as Paula mentioned, have different rituals and practices that foster a sense of reverence and responsibility towards nature, be it mountains, be it water bodies, and different species. For example, the Buddhists speaking say that every life is sacred, so they do not harm anybody. Traditional knowledge can be used to bolster the efforts of environmental conservation because we can see that the land owned by indigenous people only accounts for like 20% of the global Earth surface, but it hosts about 80% of the global biodiversity as per research. And they have been living in these forests for like hundreds and thousands of years, so they know thing too about sustainable practices which we do not know about. Many indigenous lands are within the biodiversity hotspot, or they are biodiversity hotspots in themselves. So we need to conserve these sacred lands in order to conserve biodiversity as a whole in the world. So here we look on some examples of how indigenous communities and traditional knowledge can be used. First, the Mijikenda peoples in the Kenyan region. They have different kayas or forest sanctuaries which they live in, and they protect these. They protect their community by living in these kaya forests. So much so that UNESCO has considered it to be of international heritage as a UNESCO heritage site status in 2009. The major issue with kaya forests is that the Mijikenda people only believe that people above the age of 50 can be caretakers of these kaya forests. So the poachers and hunters tend to harm these old caretakers in order to fell trees for timber and other purposes. The Maasai community in Africa is very known for their pastoral and nomadic lifestyle because they know where they can get the best feed for their cattle. But as droughts have become increasingly severe following the 1980s major drought in that area, they had to leave their pastoralist nomadic lifestyle and their cattle because cattle were dying in absence of any feed because there was no rainfall at all. We know about that, how important the sacred natural sites are for the American peoples, the Red Indians or the First Peoples, but legal and cultural barriers to conservation, wherein majority of these people have been excluded from their sites by the federal government or other governments. They failed to conserve their own land because they were expelled from it. Another example is in the Eastern Asian Balinese water temple system. They construct excellent irrigation systems as a part of their water temples because they consider rice as a gift from God. So they want to preserve it. Another example that's very close to my heart and my home, because I hail from Rajasthan, India. We have these traditionally covered wells. These are called tankas. They store filtered rainwater throughout the year, so people don't go out of rainwater because the groundwater is mostly saline and not usable. So these tanks store fresh water throughout the year. the people that can afford have individual or private tankas, and there are community tanks as well. Also, large ponds for cattle and animal usage, as well as human usage at the village level, are common in the traditional way, but not nowadays. That's why we in Rajasthan have a severe water shortage all throughout the year. Now there is some problem with this, because we think that integrating this traditional knowledge will always be useful, but hear me out. The implementation of these laws and policies regarding these sacred rivers and sacred sites is also important, because the Ganga River and the Yamuna River, which is a tributary of the Ganga River, these are considered the holiest rivers in India, but they are also, sadly, the most polluted rivers in India. Now we come to challenges concerning these sacred sites and indigenous knowledge. People do not know about these things. So that's why a communication gap and a knowledge gap is seen, which leads to lesser awareness about these things. Threats to sacred site, rapid urbanization and industrialization can pose significant threats, as we see in all parts of the world. Cultural erosion because of a sort of disconnectedness with the indigenous knowledge and peoples. We need to partner with them to recognize their rights and recognize their knowledge that can lead to successful conservation efforts. We need to bolster these efforts by intervening with policy and advocacy at different governmental levels. Research, as Paula mentioned, research work on these traditional knowledge and traditional areas is very important. We need to research on them. We need to document these conservation efforts to understand them and fulfill their dreams. Capacity building at all levels is very important, and sustainable practices should be practiced at different levels, be it individual level or the community levels. So in order to conclude my presentation, we know that indigenous traditions should be respected, which aren't, sadly, because their knowledge has been lost or not prospered in the modern world. These people have a deep connection with natural resources and have been using them cautiously and sustainably for a very, very long time. We can't even imagine that. Fortress conservation efforts, which leave these people out of their homelands, should be avoided, and traditional knowledge should lead the path to conservation. Collaborating with these indigenous peoples and creating a sort of awareness among local communities that live together with these indigenous peoples should be prioritized. Leave no one behind should be the motto of conservation. And in last, there is a quote from an ancient Native American proverb: "We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gauravjit, for this very insightful presentation. We see how water is central in the lives of very different communities in different parts of the world. So now we have a few minutes left for taking questions from the participants. Please ask them to the Q&A function in Zoom. We have a general, I saw that some of very specific questions addressed to specific panelists were already answered, but I will take a general question and I will ask each one of the panelists, if you please turn on your cameras, and each one take 1 minute to answer. What is the role of water in community-based adaptation to climate change? Malcolm, perhaps you would like to start since you were the first presenter. If you, Malcolm? Okay, Alex.
Yeah. I think Gauri should take that one. Take a whack at that, Gauravjit.
Okay, Gauravjit, then Paul, then we will take the reverse order. Gauravjit.
We know that water is essential to many communities around the world. we need to hear them out. We need to understand why water is essential to them and how their knowledge can be used to conserve water, rather than imposing our knowledge on them, because they have been living there for longer than we have been.
Paula, you would like to add something?
Yes, I agree with that, but we also need to use new technologies for this for the adaptation strategies. So the combination of them is I think the good formula.
David or Alex would like to add something?
Yeah, I can add. I think water is a fantastic entry point for working with communities. I mean, everybody is so connected to water, whether it's for drinking, agriculture, or hit by water because of floods. So I think one thing that I think that COP doesn't tend to incorporate too much in the COP messaging is the important role of water in adaptation, especially at the community level. I mean, think about it. There's agricultural practices. There's is there enough water for cities? Is impacted by climate change. So many things. I'm affected by floods and droughts. So it kind of, for communities, is so central. And I think it's more of a message that IWRA can kind of help promote at COP meetings, is that role of water in adaptation strategies at the community level, right? Not at this big global picture. So I like that question a lot. Thank you.
And in my case, Raya, I'd like to mention that we need to define what is the size. No, when we are talking about the community level, we need to define what is the size of the community level, because it's not the same when we are talking about in a small town, when you have maybe people living just agriculture or subsistence. It's different, suppose, in Bolivia or in the rural zone in Chile. But another thing is the middle city, intermediate city, or big cities, because maybe the community level depends on what is the size of population we are talking about, and what is the governance at local level is very important, because one thing is the community, but another thing is the governance. The governance to try to create adaptation planning to make more resilience and against of the climate shocks. So, if my opinion is the community approaches they are a very good approach, but we need to define how could be the governance, because when we are talking about the cities, for example, here in Boston, we have a very good and forecasted and flooding for the future. Yes, but it's a big city. So how we can make the governance in adaptation plan? It's different if we are talking about the rural zone or people living in agriculture activities, because there are small people, maybe local government there. So we need to define and link the governance and what is the size of the community we are talking about to define a very properly an approach for adaptation.
Okay, thank you. Actually, under the climate change UN framework, water is considered under adaptation, and we see that water has a crucial role actually for adaptation, and at the same time, it's at the heart of climate change, like we saw from all your presentation. So it has a very important role. There's another question on local knowledge. How can local knowledge be linked with climate resilience development? What should be engineered practice? Perhaps I give the floor first to Goravjit and Paula, and then the rest can complement. Go ahead.
Paula, you can go first.
Yes. What I think is that communities, at least at the Andes, have already adapted to climate variability for hundreds of years. So they already developed some knowledge on how to deal with uncertainties, with climate uncertainties, for example, extreme events. So it's very interesting to recover this knowledge that they have. But also we need to acknowledge that we need the appropriation of the local communities for the strategies to be sustainable. So if the local communities don't appropriate from the strategies, they won't sustain the infrastructure or the strategies that the engineers or the others are developing.
Okay, Gorabjit, you like to add something?
I think Paula has covered it all. I think that's enough.
Okay, the others, would you like to add also something?
Yeah, just you know, if you kind of look at the job ahead, it's there's I think, you know, on the one hand, a lot of work that has to be done kind of with different communities, and there's a huge diversity of communities, and really one of the dangers of putting a lot of money into adaptation strategies and trying to move that money quickly is you tend to not work with communities as closely, you know, as you should. So it really is thinking about adaptation going to take the skills of say like Gorabjit and Paula to be able to really work properly with communities. So you're listening and understanding, you know, what they know and what the needs are, and then, you know, bringing in the appropriate level of help there. So I think, but it's a huge challenge that will require a lot of disciplines to work together, and one we have to be careful of because there's so many examples of, you know, kind of modernizing that don't take into consideration that local knowledge of communities. But it's something that we have to do to build that resilience and adapt. Thanks.
Malcolm or Alex, we want to add? No?
Nothing to add from me, thanks.
Okay, and we have another question. Perhaps it will be your turns. How could good water stewardship be fostered to achieve a holistic approach to addressing climate change? Who would like to take this question or to start?
Just one, maybe just to start on I think on the first challenge is trying to understand the big picture. The water is connecting the dot. This is a key issue. So if we don't have water, nothing works. So, and the water is connecting different kind of activities, you know, and drinking water, energy, and food security, and so on. So if we can understand very well how the water flow is connecting different human activities, maybe we can start to thinking in adaptation planning to trying to make more resilient different kind of system that depend of the flow of this kind of water. This is my just to start. Maybe it sounds very simple, but it's not simple, because sometimes the people think that no, the most important thing is agriculture. No, the most important thing is the, I don't know, reservoir, no, or the drinking water and so on. So this is not about prioritization of the human activities. It's how the water is interconnecting different kind of human activities that would depend of the water flow.
Just Raya, just following up on that thought, of course I think that water stewardship, water governance, you know, promoting that is really our big challenge as a water community, right? That is central, right? If we can get that right, a lot of things will follow. But I think one thing with within the water community, following up on Alex, it's good to kind of break that sectoral approach. You know, I deal with water. I'm a water specialist. It's really to be able to talk across people working in different areas, agriculture or city water. So I think that's what we have to do as a water community to really build that stewardship of water. Thank you.
Malcolm or Gorabjit or Paula? Okay, there's a specific question for Gorabjit that I can ask, but if others have answers, they can intervene too. So in Africa, many organizations have taken the initiative to engage people in climate change and capacity building, but the impact is not felt. According to you, what unique strategies can be implemented so that people pick interest?
Yeah, that's basically seen everywhere in the world. People have forgotten the traditional things and they're not interested. It seems like they're not interested, but in my experience, no effort goes in vain. We need to create mass awareness as well as policy intervention on the governmental levels. So to propagate these traditional knowledge and aspects on this water conservation, and also research can be very important in this. Integrating scientific advancements and traditional knowledge can be a key to it.
Okay, I will take a last question from one of our active member, actually, Mehretab, who says that climate change is intensifying extreme flows in many regions, including downstream of the Himalayan HKH, I don't remember the acronym, HKH region and many transboundary basins. Nature-based solutions and structural measures are urgently needed. What should be the priorities in policy to reduce socioeconomic at international river basins?
Shall I take a?
You can start, David, please.
Okay. The HKH, Hindu Kush Himalaya, but it's a similar. So many rivers cross different boundaries, and I think it's still in those river basins. International is connecting upstream and downstream, and the question is how to do that when a lot of these are politically sensitive. What I found is there are different entry points that are easier than others. If we talk about sharing water, that's quite difficult. But we can talk about sharing science, and what I found is that's people do resonate, and you'll get people, across borders wonderfully getting together and enjoying sharing the science. But a second area is nature itself, right? Biodiversity, nature-based solutions, forests, right? I think that tends to be less contentious, and people do appreciate the role of nature in kind of addressing climate change and water issues. So I think that focus on nature is really a good entry point. But whatever we do, it is the third entry point is really on disaster management, right? So nobody likes floods, so it is possible to work across different countries to address issues like floods and droughts. And part of the addressing floods and droughts is nature-based solutions like afforestation, Mehretab. I know you've worked on that a lot, right? Like supporting healthy ecosystems upstream. So those are great entry points in international river basins.
Okay, thank you, David.
Thanks.
Malcolm, perhaps you want to add something?
Yeah, I can amplify on that. It's really important to understand that if you want to point to the biggest pollutant in water, it's nitrates. And, that's from agricultural activities, that's from fertilizer. 70% of all the water that's used in the world is used for agriculture. I should say 70% of the groundwater, water being pumped out of wells. So we have a lot of basins where the lower parts of the basins, we have wells, we're recovering water. And when we think about climate change, like David says, think in terms of a basin approach, think in terms of these extreme weather events and how we're not able to capture as much water, but being aware of that. This is going to happen as a result of climate change. And a big challenge that we have is to do some kind of monitoring. And, in these developed countries, we can spend a lot of money doing lab analysis for, man-made contaminants or even nitrates or things like that. But monitoring is so important, and that can be done in just measuring the water level of wells. I saw Shami Puri and Mr. Della Pena. I mean, they have all written for years about the importance of monitoring, the importance of when you're doing monitoring, you're just measuring water levels. This is how you monitor the recharge. And the recharge is going down because we're pumping more water, but the recharge is going down because of this climate change that we're being subjected to. So we need to be aware of monitoring and again, like David says, think in terms of the basins. It's a really good way to conceptualize it.
Okay, thank you, Malcolm. I apologize if there are still unanswered questions, but we have to close this webinar. Feel free to send them to us by email, and we'll do our best to provide answers. I would like to thank the panelists for their very informative presentations, and to thank all the participants for being with us during this webinar, and then invite all the interested participants to join our task force and our working groups to provide more insights on the important topic of water and climate change. Thank you all.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Raya.
Thanks, Raya. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. I think we had a very great discussion. We had more than 170 people attending the webinar, basically from all parts of the world, especially from Europe, Africa, and Asia. Likewise, I'm glad to see young people and a gender balanced audience. Glad to see people from different organizations and backgrounds. Well, it's time to close our webinar. IWRA would like to thank again everyone for this great webinar. Thank you to our panelists, Malcolm, Alex, David, Paula, and Gurajit, as well as to our moderator, Rajesh Stefan. I hope you all found useful the insights provided by our panel during this special event, and I hope this is generating a lot of creativity about your own work as well. If these presentations left you interest in learning more, please check out our LinkedIn page and continue the discussions and follow up for more IWRA updates. In a few days, we should have the presentations and the webinar recording on our website. If you are interested in knowing more about the association or becoming a member, please visit www.iwra.org. And finally, I would like to invite you to our next webinar on June 21st at 2 p.m., Global Youth-Led Action for Water. More details will be available in the coming weeks through our communication channels. On behalf of the whole IWRA office, thank you very much to you all for attending this webinar. Have a beautiful day, afternoon, or evening. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Arturo.
Bye-bye, and thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.